while beneath lay the almost unaltered hell message of the Middle Ages, Bosch painting in the same years the very techniques of Renaissance, substantiating the nightmare of damnation. Luther: faith must trample underfoot all reason, sense, and understanding, and wish to know nothing but the Word of God. The pity lay in this, that the floating humanist hope had to work itself out against those demonic possessions. As in Bruegel's documentary Triumph of Death, it could not be actualized without the cleavage and cross-breeding struggle of new on old, the Lutheran and Calvinist broils, Inquisition, 30 Years' War, the destruction of the most progressive parts of Europe, with a harvest reaching across the Rhine to the madnesses of our own age. In Rubens, in Swalink's echo-fantasies, the enormous energies of the Baroque form in a tumult that also sweeps the English stage. From Lear's, we cry that we are come to this great stage of fools. Through Webster's, in what a shadow or deep pit of darkness doth womanish and fearful mankind live. To Beaumont and Fletcher's Maid, and the trees about me, let them be bare and leafless, let the rocks groan with continual surges, and behind me make all a desolation. When the great volitional grandeur speaks again, as in Rembrandt or the composer Scheidt, it is with the Miltonic organ tones formed at the heart of a century of religious wars. Who knows not that truth is strong next to the Almighty? In those organ tones, what Thoreau would call the last important news from Europe had been divulged, which was essentially why the revolution could be so slight in America in 1776. Its homogeneous religious vanguard had been transplanted a century and a half before from the old world to the new, as if Cromwell, Milton, Rembrandt, Schütz, and Huygens had come with the pilgrims, forgotten their intenser callings, and become breeding stock. New England branched off from that stem, and it preserved in stiff colonial form the dark religious claim through a century of preachers debating out of the Bible rights and sovereignty. Tolerant Thomas Hooker. The foundation of authority is laid firstly in the free consent of the people, and whereas it hath been charged that through their ignorance and unskilfulness they are not able to wield such privileges, the Lord hath promised to take away the veil from all faces. Against Winthrop, steward of theocracy, we see not that any should have authority to set up any other exercise beside what authority hath already set up. Meanwhile, in Europe, as the humanist and rational forces of the Renaissance slowly assert themselves, they do so in the great formal frames of church and state. Bernini in Italy, the conversion of Constantine. In France, Lebrun. The thrust of Renaissance usurped and appropriated by such pompous formulations as the monarch of the sun, mounted on the same Bernini horse, campaigning against the Protestant lowlands. It is the deflection of humanist energy through Baroque religiosity and the dangerously overblown heroics of courtly grandeur that saddles the 18th century with a deeply cloven loyalty and aim. Hear the royal march of Louis XIV. The heroic style is here so close to mock-heroic that one might question what the art means. The overstretched assertion that all is for the best in this best of all possible kingdoms, pumped up through the wars of the Spanish succession and the virtual bankruptcy of France, would break with the king's death to the regency. The delicious mockery and rococo sentiment of Watteau, while music, with Couperin's miniatures, breaks at the same time. Which brings us back to the century and style of the George Washington minuet. Between the great assertive thrusts of Baroque and Revolutionary, the 18th century hangs in all its richness, a catenary of question and regrouping. Like the Hegelian word aufheben, the 18th century plays a triple role. It terminates in mockery the heroic vaunts of the great Baroque. It continues that basic assurance under the ironically smiling mask of Voltaire. It raises up Goethe on the Campagna, in transcending form the human and utopian claim, shifting it from its old center in reason toward a new center in the passion of creative will. As Werther says, was ich weiß, kann jeder wissen, mein Herz hab ich allein. What I know, each can know, only the heart is mine. How the revolution will relate to this transition will vary from place to place with the slightest shiftings in the social complex. It is a subtle but telling shift from the novels of Marivaux to those of Richardson, Fielding, and Sterne. So too from the courtly airs Watteau disarmingly parodies, to the mid-century English elegance Gainsborough and the rest partly mock and partly celebrate on the parks and estates of England. An even smaller but still significant migration takes us from the English house to those Georgian imitations along the shores of the Chesapeake and James, or, most original and natural, to Palladian Monticello. Immediately two levels of revolution become possible. A kind of minimal level, which could only occur where the blend of middle class and landed gentry was sufficiently benign and law-abiding to offer its own rather wigged and robed convention of freehold elegance and Lockean law as the human base a constitutional republic required. Against this milder possibility, a more deeply cutting maximal likelihood was hardly to be avoided, where, as in absentee France, an eroded aristocracy seemed the parasitic artifice to be uprooted before the natural man could expatiate in freedom, equality, and brotherhood. Beside the liberal mean of the colonies, this Europe was a complex of tensile starrings, convergent opposites. Here the surfeit of rococo play, marriage à la mode, this Fragonard husband pulling a swing while the wife kicks a slipper to the underpeering lover. Thus Jefferson, 1785, opposed the education of American youth in Europe. He acquires a fondness for European luxury and dissipation, and a contempt for the simplicity of his own country. Though forthright Englishmen, Fielding and the rest, had written similarly about the dangers of going from England to France, surely there was a fine directness to the Copley Boston portraits of before the Revolution. But plain humanity breathing Republican spirit was cropping out everywhere, as here with Chardin in France. Like the enlightened couple in Joseph Andrews, Joseph's parents, it turns out, part of the natural and human Eden to be progressively reclaimed. Il faut cultiver notre jardin. What distinguished America was the consistency of the simple, its lack of antinomies, while under courtly Europe and under the Enlightenment, from early in the century, as in Swift's Yahoos and Piranesi's prison scenes, there had yawned a splenetic dark cellar, Siwa indignatio. Was it the madhouse of avoidable corruption and cruelty, or the doomed reversal of Renaissance reason and hope, the heroic fretted vault become the dungeon of man irremediably flawed? In that Europe, one morning of 1786, in the pre-romantic dawn of free humanity, Goethe, child of courtliness and defiance, of enlightenment and Gothic terror, leaned out of a Roman window on his Italian journey and was sketched by Tischbein. It is like an aria from Mozart's Don Giovanni, De Vieni alla finestra. Goethe might almost have been singing it to a passing flower girl, maybe the one who became his mistress, and he wrote the poem of waking in the morning, his arm around her, his fingers strumming the long hexameters on her back. But in the opera, seduction yields to the chromatics of damnation, and Goethe, in classical Rome, was writing of the rejuvenation of Faust in a Gothic witch's kitchen. He practiced sketching also on that trip. Here a gouache of Vesuvius in eruption. Faust's ambivalent cry was for Goethe himself, as for revolutionary Europe, two souls, alas, dwell in my breast, zwei Seelen wohnen, ach, in meiner Brust. Goethe, in fact, at that classical window, and with his Gothic soul, was perhaps the only man in the world who saw clearly and creatively what we now realize about the divided relation of revolution to the larger motion of the West, that there was a daytime conscious phase in which both he and Faust had to take up the fresh and liberating humanism of the Renaissance, the 1500 promise of reason glimpsed only to be lost in religious wars and hardening method, courtly artifice and kingly foppery, had to act as if those 300 years had never intervened. But of course they had, unalterably. It was not only the old dark and superstition to be put aside by Jeffersonian light, but the false pomp of state, the wit and wigs of misguided enlightenment, the web of analytic and mocking reason, the noble vault turned prison. Here revolution explodes against all limitation and sane order, within and without. It erupts in storm and stress, Titan rebellion, romantic hunger, and the Gothic novel. Delacroix's dream-haunted revival of the Middle Ages of faith and mystery, which the other daylight Faust would have planned to dispel. That Goethe could hold and use all that was the greatness of which Napoleon remarked, "Voilà un homme." Thus the Wald und Höhle, wood and cave scene of Faust, with its cleavage already anticipated in Werther's Love and Suicide, between calm possession of nature and mind, and a destructive Satanism raging like a cataract into the abyss. That Europe, striving within and without against hereditary bondage, was already driven beyond good and evil into satanic compact, or as Blake put it, the marriage of heaven and hell. Goya, about 1815, made Prometheus the symbol. Had not Goethe more than 40 years before written the poem that gave Promethean its new and ultimately Nietzschean meaning? Jefferson would say, I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. But what of the tyranny of that altar? Paine, the only American to assault it publicly, was reviled and ostracized. But Goethe had long before spoken the words of Prometheus, Bedecke deinen Himmel, Zeus, mit Wolkendunst. Darken your heaven, Zeus, with dusk of clouds, and like a boy who lops off thistles, spend yourself on oaks and mountain crags. But this my earth, look you let stand, my house too, that you did not build, and this my hearth, whose glowing fire incites your jealousy. I know nothing under the sun more wretched than you are, gods. On tithes of sacrifice and breath of prayers you feed penurious shreds of majesty, and you would starve if children and beggars were not hopeful fools. When I was a child, I could not tell truth from lie. I turned bewildered eyes to the sun, as if an ear were there inclined to my complaining, a heart like mine to pity and relieve. Who shielded me against the pride of Titans, rescued me from death and slavery? You, sacred glowing heart, have we not worked these things, and then deceived in youth and goodness, poured out thanks and praise to the sleeping fraud of heaven? I honor you. Wherefore? Have you once eased the torments of the afflicted, once appeased the tears of the disquieted? Was I not wrought to manhood by time the Almighty and fate eternal, your masters as they are mine? Did you assume, perhaps, I would disdain life and fly to the wilderness, because not all my flowering dreams ripened? No, here I sit and fashion mortals after my image, a race of men to be as I am, to suffer and to weep, to relish, to enjoy, and to despise as I do, you and yours. Ein Geschlecht, das mir gleich sei, zu leiden, zu weinen, zu genießen und zu freuen sich, und dein nicht zu achten, wie ich. The musical climax paralleling these haunting Goya symbols of about 1811, this city on a rock, its winged defenders hovering over the fire assault of dark swarms, is no doubt in Beethoven. But it was the Mozart of the courtly style and of the style of frenzy, who also in the Jupiter Symphony, 1788-89, had forged the affirming spearhead of revolution. We have cheated on Mozart by accompanying the last bars of the Jupiter with Grose's rather windy Napoleon. But was it to be avoided where history cheated on the spirit of revolution, setting Rousseau's general will at war with itself? As Shelley put it later in Prometheus Unbound, names there are, nature's sacred watchwords. The nations thronged around and cried aloud, truth, liberty, and love. Suddenly fierce confusion fell. Tyrants rushed in and did divide the spoil. Wordsworth was in France and described the first ecstasy. Triumphant looks were then the common language of all eyes. As if awaked from sleep, the nations hailed their great expectancy. The fife of war was then a spirit-stirring sound indeed, a blackbird's whistle in a vernal grove. Goethe was on the border and told in Hermann und Dorothea how the soldiers came like liberators. They planted the glad tree of freedom, promising that each should be his own ruler. Coleridge summed it up in his poem to Wordsworth, the fiery spirit Dannecker aimed at in his busts of Schiller. Amid the tremor of a realm aglow, amid a mighty nation jubilant, when from the general heart of humankind hope sprang forth like a full-born deity. Coleridge added, of that dear hope afflicted and struck down, and Wordsworth, it was a lamentable time for man. Goya, who would witness the guerrilla terrors of the Peninsular War, already lowers from the page of his Capriccios, as if to answer with a fierce Bronx cheer the rapt Schiller zeal which would miscarry so disastrously over Europe, a plague on both your houses. A generation lived through the shock of revolutionary reversal, driven back to the dark wisdom of Milton. License they mean when they cry liberty, for who loves that must first be wise and good. So Coleridge, the sensual and dark rebel in vain, slaves by their own compulsion. And Goethe, after telling how the early rapture soured into the atrocities of the Rhine invasion, returned to the same ground. May I never again in such contemptuous madness look upon man. Better the beast in his rage. Never let him speak of freedom as if he could rule his own passions. But Goya shaped the most searing indictment of all, to show man once and forever the beast he is. So the radiant opening of Beethoven's Third turns in the Fifth to the grim hammering of fate. Against the Goya, an anger of 1810 liberation. Though Beethoven brought the Fifth to transcendental victory. Beside that cloven Europe, torn by a violence as fierce as its vision is radically soaring, how plain our American aspirations seemed, how wholesomely pursued and fruitfully realized. Boston had produced a revolutionary composer too, Billings, working in the time of Copley and Charles Wilson Peale. Blamed by connoisseurs for using no dissonance in his fuguing tunes, he wrote a short cacophony, jargon, only 2 lines long, ending, "As terrible as thunder." Is it a joke or an Ives potentiality? What represents Billings is rather, "Be glad then, America," a gladness of the consonant earth.
Yea, the Lord will answer and say unto his people, Behold, I will send you corn and wine and oil.
And ye shall be satisfied.
And ye shall be satisfied.
And ye shall be satisfied.
Be satisfied, be satisfied, be satisfied therewith. Be satisfied, be satisfied, be satisfied therewith. Be glad then, America, be glad then, America. Be glad then, America, be glad then, America.
The closest America came to radical unrest was in Shays' Rebellion, a populist uprising in western Massachusetts in 1786. It sprang from post-revolutionary manipulation of money and land, and was often referred to in arguments for a stronger government and constitution. What we hear of it comes mostly from the outraged men of property and station. Thus General Knox to George Washington: "Their creed is that the property of the United States has been protected from the confiscation of Britain by the joint exertions of all, and therefore ought to be the common property of all. We find we are men, actual men, possessing all the turbulent passions belonging to that animal, and that we must have a government proper and adequate for him." Jefferson wrote back from Paris, 1787, about the same late rebellion in Massachusetts: "I hold that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing, and as necessary in the political world as storms in the physical. It is a medicine necessary for the sound health of government." To have said that, and been named just after Secretary of State, and later elected President, speaks not only to the temper of Jefferson, but to the breadth of that America. But it does not clarify the naivete of the optimism, to betray no sign of the European cleavage, to make revolution and practical enlightenment one motion of the mind. Yet if any American could have participated in the deeper moral shake-up of the wider revolution, it should have been Jefferson. He saw the beginning of the terror in France, and wrote after his return, 1793, "My own affections have been deeply wounded by some of the martyrs to this cause." Condorcet would die the year after. "But rather than it should have failed, I would have seen half the earth desolated." Evil and disaster struck in his own family.